If friends could enter and find a seat and settle into some silence, that would be wonderful. Good afternoon, friends. I love that. My name is Christina Keefe Perry. I'm a member of Fresh Pond Meeting in Cambridge and the host of Quaker Dinner Church, which is a ministry under the care of Fresh Pond Meeting. Today, I'm serving as your panel moderator. I will try to be of few words so that we can hear from our panelists. These panelists have been preparing and being prepared for many months. And I have had the gift and the honor of being able to walk with them and to witness the ways that they have been yoked together in the Spirit. There is a little housekeeping before we start. After the housekeeping, I will introduce the three panelists. At that point, we'll settle into silence, and from that silence, the first speaker will begin. Each speaker will speak for approximately 12 minutes. Between speakers, I want to invite us to settle back into the silence. Not an open worship offering comments or vocal ministry kind of silence, but the kind of silence where the ministry that they have given us is a round, worn river rock that has been tossed into the pool of this gathered body, where we let the ripples of the ministry that they have brought wash over us and lap at the edges of this pool. If after all three panelists have brought their ministry and there is time, we will have some time for open worship or a kind of fishbowl discussion among the three panelists. We're still waiting to see where the winds of spirit blow. I also want to say that although these friends have been faithfully preparing, the most faithful piece for them to bring to us may not be a message today. In that case, I would commend to you the words of Isaac Pennington. If the Spirit do not require to speak, then everyone is to sit in their place, feeling their own measure, feeding, receiving into their spirit whatever the Lord giveth. Silence can be faithful service too. I have one last invitation. These friends might use language that is unfamiliar to you. It might be different than your spiritual vernacular. I've heard in these sorts of cases, friends invited to listen in tongues, to do the work of translating to your own interior spiritual language. That's a fine thing to do, and you can do that. And I also want you to be invited to consider the language that these friends are using, and if it is difficult and foreign to you, to maybe not do the work of translation, but feel invited to take in language that is different from your own. Certainly, if it is stimulating of any past injury, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. But if there is new and difficult terminology, hold on to it. And when you get to your anchor groups, if you have anchor groups, or if you don't, when you get to a trusted friend, turn to someone and talk to them about what you've heard and how it made you feel. Following the speakers, in a period of open worship, folks will be dismissed to their anchor groups. There will be a short announcement about how that all is going to work at the end, so bear with us at the end for that piece of housekeeping. Now, our panelists. To my immediate right is Sarah Walton. Sarah grew up in New England Yearly Meeting among young friends under the leadership of Andy Grinnell at that time. She's a member of Vassalboro Friends Meeting in Maine, and she clerked the statewide equivalent of FCNL, the Friends Committee on Maine Public Policy. For the past 5 years, Sarah has been living in Georgia and sojourning with Atlanta Friends Meeting. She is a lawyer, and she uses that training to work at the intersection and edges of racial and social justice. Next to Sarah is Adria Gulizia. Adria is a member of Chatham Summit Meeting in New York Yearly Meeting. She's also a founding member of the Friends of Jesus Fellowship. She has a ministry of writing, and Adria, too, is a lawyer who works in Manhattan. This coming winter, Adria is stepping boldly out of that work and into a period of discernment about what it looks like to have vocation and calling be more closely aligned. Next to Adria is Meg Klepack. Meg is a member of South Starksboro Monthly Meeting and a member of Sandwich Monthly Meeting and attends South Starksboro Monthly Meeting in Vermont. She is in medical school, training to be a family physician. She enjoys long walks. In fact, Meg walked 87 miles from her home to this yearly meeting sessions as part of her preparation. When Meg isn't studying, she turns herself over to a deep discipline of prayerful listening. For months, these friends have been prepared and been preparing to address the theme of our yearly meeting sessions. In fear and trembling, be bold in God's service. Along with, it is as great presumption to send our passions upon God's errands as it is to palliate them with God's name. And love is the hardest lesson in Christianity, but for that reason, it should be most our care to learn it. All from William Penn and Fruits of Solitude. Let us settle into expectant waiting, and the first speaker will rise out of that silence.
In fear and trembling, be bold in God's service. This theme, I first struggled with it quite a bit. The way friends have traditionally tried to test phrases and leadings. One way is to test by consistency with Scripture, consistency with our faith traditions, writers and individuals and their experiences. Also with our own experience. At the same time, being open to continuing revelation. And so, for me, I knew that frequently what other people ascribed as boldness didn't really feel necessarily like boldness to me, but I could understand that part of that was stepping out, speaking up at what might be perceived as risk to myself or others. In God's service. That was a phrase that I particularly appreciated, how that the theme was put in the context of maxims by William Penn. And the fruit of the solitude maxims was his advice to his then motherless children to give them life guidance. And yes, it uses very archaic language, like, it says greater presumption to send your passions upon God's errands. And trying to figure out what that meant. But it meant to me that it can be ego-based and some form of not necessarily be following what our inward teacher, our guide, we sometimes, Quakers use that phrase of outrunning your guide, meaning that it's important to make sure that this leading, which may well send us on our way to the journey, that we don't then just keep onward, pushing hard, particularly when I think about how in our dominant culture, our dominant European, American culture, we do look at a lot of advocacy as efforts to overcome, overthrow, dominate, and win. And we know as people who have sometimes been a part of efforts to change legislation, you get legislation changed and then the dominant system just changes how it continues. An example of that is we've recently had an emphasis on ending mass incarceration. And from people who I've been closely working with, formerly incarcerated people, their families, also with members of law enforcement, we need to be aware that perhaps we are just moving from mass incarceration to mass community surveillance of those people who have often been oppressed. I also think that when we are trying to discern what is in God's service, it just struck me as something that felt difficult. I wasn't sure what that meant. And these three separate phrases, in fear and trembling, be bold, in God's service, if you just change one word, instead of in God's service, you talk about in service of the good, that all can be found in Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard was coming from a space of discernment, of a strong spiritual faith. But after a while, some of his ideas were used to sort of justify manifest destiny. And so it just struck me as a little hard. I also know from my own experience that people sometimes look to me as an expert on various things. I think that that can be an enormous opportunity to have arrogance that is fully not what God may be calling you for. When I was clerk of Friends Committee on Maine Public Policy in Maine under the tutelage of Ed Snyder, he always wanted us to make sure that we were focusing on issues that helped those who were oppressed, but worked with them, and that perhaps were issues that others were not working with. So that helped to sometimes things that people said were impossible, it made them possible. So the two issues that Ed Snyder had discerned as most important was greatly diminishing a horrific high use of solitary confinement, and also to support efforts for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission process between Maine as a state and the Wabanaki people, particularly with what happened with child welfare, in which children were taken from homes long after there was federal law specifying that you really did need to at least consider ongoing culture and what that family placements would probably be most helpful. And that also reminded me that sometimes, indeed, the road to hell is paved with Quaker good intentions. And one example of that might well be the Quaker Indian boarding schools, in which people were sure that they were doing the right thing, that they were doing what they believed was best. And another example might well be that, although later Quakers repudiated it, that Quakers also brought the penitentiary system idea to this country. And if you're just looking at your own experience, it may well be that that would work with Quakers, but not necessarily prevent other people from it being an act of torture and trauma. So I would ask that we insert question marks. And part of that inserting question marks might be with each of the three phrases, and to find a way to hold our assumptions lightly. Hold assumptions that we make about other people, about what is right, and to listen to those most impacted. And I hold in my heart the Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of thee but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God.
Friends, aha, there we go. American friends tend to be a highly educated and accomplished group of people, and I'm reminded of that even sitting here in between these brilliant, accomplished women. I'm certainly no exception to that rule. I graduated at the top of my class from probably the most prestigious high school in the country. Graduated at the top of my class from one of the most prestigious colleges in the country. Fluent in 2 languages. When I applied for law school, I was admitted to several Ivy League institutions. And I'm a senior associate at one of the most prestigious law firms in New York. None of this is anything that you couldn't get by looking at my LinkedIn profile. And so you may be wondering why I'm telling you this. I'm telling you this because these accomplishments, for all of the satisfaction that they've brought me, for all of the effort, took a lot of effort to do all that, they've also been a great source of pride. And I don't mean that warm, fuzzy, ushy-gushy pride you feel when your child takes their first steps. That's a beautiful feeling. I mean something a lot darker than that. I have been told that I'm a pretty likable person. But for a reasonably likable person, I developed, over the course of racking up these accomplishments, a remarkable capacity for contempt. Contempt for people who fly American flags on their lawns. Don't they know that America's not as good as all that? We've committed our fair share of crimes too. Contempt for people who oppose gay marriage. Bigots, homophobes, my God, how can we share a country with people like that? Contempt for people who espouse pro-life views and values. Get your hands off my womb. Contempt for people who ask strangers if they know Jesus. First, what business is it of yours? And how vulgar, how tacky. As well-educated and well-informed as I was and am, I learned at a very early age to articulate that contempt, never rudely. Again, I'm a likable person. Wouldn't do to be rude. I was, raised to be polite. But incisively, eloquently, and stinking of pride. But nobody ever mentioned that because that's normal. That's how we are. That's how I was raised in the environment that I was raised. And it would not have occurred to anybody to ask me about being prideful because why would they? I was right. They were right. They agreed with me. I agreed with them. We were all on the same page together in our contempt. We often think of being bold in God's service as speaking truth to power, calling out racism and sexism and homophobia, and it is often that. I have a blog in the shadow of Babylon where I do some of that, and it's important. It's important to speak truth. But as a lifelong Democrat, even a Bernie bro, from a family of lifelong Democrats, in a secular environment, in a part of the country where everyone I personally interact with almost is a progressive, or at least pays lip service to social value, to social justice, surrounded by friends and colleagues who by and large share the same cultural orientation and assumptions that I do, it doesn't take boldness to rail against evangelicals or Republicans or gun owners. There's nothing bold about it. If you put speaking truth to power in the paradigm of David and Goliath, we're Goliath, not David. What has frightened me and disturbed me and required prayer and courage are completely different things. Committing to observe the Lord's Day as a Sabbath while I was in law school. I started that when I was in law school, and I stuck to that commitment through studying for the bar exam, which actually got me pushback within my meeting. Oh, I'm not sure I would do all that. I mean, giving up a day of studying every week. And being the only Christian at my firm to request Sabbath observance, though there were plenty of Jews who did, that took boldness. refusing to participate in a friendly office pool because I believe, consistent with our Quaker tradition, that every dollar that we earn is a blessing from God and needs to be stewarded and not hazarded away on chance. That took courage. Praying for supervisors who gossiped about me and deliberately damaged my career. Launching a blog, my blog which I mentioned, which I had to disclose to our data management personnel as part of our media use policy. Working up the courage to come back to the office on January 3rd after a long period of discernment, covering my hair in response to promptings of the Spirit. And maybe more than anything else, starting to move in a gift of evangelism. That took boldness. That took courage. That happened amidst great fear and trembling. The evangelism story is a funny one. I mean, Friends of Jesus Fellowship, and it's such a blessing to see a face from Friends of Jesus Fellowship. Hey, hoot. We, from the very beginning, have been curious about and exploring spiritual gifts because it was our belief, our conviction, that it's not everybody's job to do everything, but it is everybody's job to do the thing that God calls you to. And so we took this spiritual gift inventory that had, I kid you not, probably 150 questions. And the idea is that you come up with a list of your active gifts, things that you're already doing, and a list of latent gifts, which are things that you should explore that maybe God is calling you to. The very number one latent gift for me was evangelism. And when I got that result, I was so horrified and revolted because I remembered, I'm from New Jersey, but I lived for a few years in Georgia, and the day is seared on my memory when I was waiting in the lunch line for turkey tetrazzini. I get a tap on my shoulder, and the student behind me asks me if I know Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. And on that day, I said to myself, if I ever become that person, you can take me out back and put me out of my misery, kill the pod. I have been body snatched. This is not me. We will just never go down those dark roads. But in the wake of that test, I took a step and I started to do some reading. And I realized that despite what I had been told about Friends not evangelizing, we have a proud history of crossing continents to preach the good news. I started reading my Bible and realized that out of the very few direct commands that Jesus ever gave his followers, going out and preaching the gospel and making disciples was front and center, and not as an option if you had the time, but as part of the heart of what it meant to follow Christ. This is something, despite being raised Baptist and hearing sermons, great sermons that formed me every Sunday, we never got that message. And bit by bit, I learned what Jesus was asking when he told his disciples that they had to love their enemies. His followers, including the first Friends who viewed the Quaker movement as primitive Christianity revived, understood that we have to stand strong against evil, strive for lives of honesty, fidelity, generosity, and holiness, but truly love the people whose lives show the opposite. And the only way to do that is to recognize the truth that our enemy is never the person sitting in front of us. I'm going to repeat that for emphasis. Our enemy is never the person sitting in front of us. Our enemy is the web of evil and weakness and insecurity that creates toxic ideologies, and you better be humble when you love that person because you're trapped in some of those webs too. That's what I realized. And so as hard as we have to fight, we also have to love, and we have to love twice as hard because loving is a lot harder than fighting. That's what friends traditionally call the Lamb's War, what other Christians call spiritual warfare. And I commend to your attention a book that we were not able to get because it's in the process of getting reprinted, called Reviving Old Scratch, which is a great book about spiritual warfare and the devil for people who are not sure that they believe in spiritual warfare and the devil. And so what I understood is that I had to take a lot of little steps to move along that path of love. But more than that, the challenge of love has been the challenge of losing all of the ways that I identified myself. And it's not, the harder part wasn't losing it to other people, but losing it to myself, losing my identity as clever and competent, urbane, sophisticated, not one of those people who would ever pray in tongues. Wrong. Not one of those people who would ever pray with a stranger on an airplane. Wrong. Not one of those people who would ever talk about evangelism, much less allow a friend of mine to publish a piece called Spirit-Led Evangelism on his blog, which he showed me the reads, and I was like, oh gosh, maybe I should have used a synonym, but here we are. And so being bold in God's service for me has meant becoming a fool for Christ. It's meant becoming everything I didn't hate, everything I despised, everything I had contempt for, everything that I knew in my heart I was better than. And it's been doing it over and over and over again, dying to the sense that faith is purely private. I have had to learn painfully, in fear and in trembling, to say with the Apostle Paul that Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. And at each step, I have known what I was risking. It has been very clear to me what I was risking, what I could lose, and I have had no idea whether I would gain anything in return. So I ask you, friends, have you met the Spirit of Christ? Do you know the good news? Have you encountered a gospel that you are willing to be a fool for? That you are willing to lay down education and cultural identity and political conviction for? Have you met a gospel that will let you sit down and break bread with Black Lives Matter activists and with men's rights activists, with activists for trans recognition, and with activists for gun rights? And if you have met that gospel, I want to encourage you that every step that you take in pursuing it and living into it is a step of eternal importance and moment. Because every person that you admire, every person who's been a hero visibly, has had to take 100 steps that were invisible of heroism in order to get to that point. And I know Christina is so gracious and I'm out of time, but I do want to read one passage that has been speaking to me so powerfully over the past months, over the past weeks. Because when we think about faith, it's very abstract, but faith literally means doing what you're called without any assurance that anything good will come of it, and knowing painfully what you can lose. And so this passage of faith is from Hebrews 11, and it goes on past this, and I encourage you to consult it. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what was seen was made from things that are not visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain's. Through this he received approval as righteous, God himself giving approval to his gifts. He died, but through his faith he still speaks. By faith Enoch was taken so he did not experience death, and he was not found because God had taken him. For it was attested before he was taken away that he had pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God. For whoever would approach him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith, Noah, warned by God about events as yet unseen, respected the warning and built an ark to save his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir to the righteousness that is in accordance with faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, he received the power of procreation, even though he was too old, and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered him faithful who had promised it. Therefore, from one person, and this as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven, and as innumerable as the grains of sand by the seashore. All of these died in faith without receiving the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they could have returned to it. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them.
Hello. It's an honor to sit here in front of you today. The faith in my heart, the faithful life that I attempt to lead, is only possible, is only alive in this world because I know you are all walking alongside of me. I am utterly grateful. A number of years ago, I spent 3 weeks walking. I hope you'll indulge me in some small stories today. I think the granular helps us see the enormity that is harder for me to capture in words. My partner Jay and I spent 3 weeks walking the length of Vermont. It's 270 miles south to north along the spine of the Green Mountains. On that journey, I discovered a freedom that I had never tasted before. We had an abundance of time. And so we started a little game. We called it the or plan game. Each day, waking up in the morning, we would talk about what our options were. We could hike 20 miles north to the next shelter, or we could sit in this comfortable shelter right here that we're already at, or we could walk to the next road crossing and hitch into town for ice cream. Or once I discovered how freeing hitchhiking was, I didn't see any reason we couldn't keep going and hitch all the way to California. It may sound trite to talk about ice cream and walking, and yet I believe there's a deep power that kind of freedom is possible in our normal day-to-day lives if we allow space for it. That the expectations of my parents, that the expectations of our society are not the ones that we need to serve, allows us the freedom of things like declaring bankruptcy, walking away from obligations to our relationships. In the challenging words of Mary Oliver, she asks, "Are you willing to disappoint another to be true to yourself?" With all of these seemingly limitless options in life, how are we to move forward? Which doorway do we choose to walk through every day? Why do I continue to show up at my job? Why do I continue to show up in my relationship? Why do I continue to show up at my meeting? What am I serving? Around the same time that I took that long walk in the woods, I started noticing a little inward nudge. It was gentle. I felt it in my body. There would be an opening of my heart or sometimes a twisting of my gut. It was around simple things sometimes. I would be wondering what to have for dinner and contemplating the difference between a salad and a cheeseburger. And there would be something lovely about the way my body felt when I considered the idea of a salad. Again, trite, but so powerful if we pause to listen. Again and again and again every day, moment by moment, submitting ourselves to that gentle guidance. And there were also times when that nudge was a little bit more persistent and a little bit stronger and a little bit more daring. It would ask me to do things that I didn't feel were within my comfort zone, but that felt enlivening and joyous when I considered them. It led me to go to DC shortly after Hurricane Irene struck Vermont, flooding the farm where I was working. I went and I joined Bill McKibben and Wendell Berry and others who were sitting in front of the White House and got arrested for the first time. And the fruits of finding the place where I sensed the yes, I am moving forward that direction, despite not understanding intellectually why that is my path, I will go there. And the places where I feel no or stop or I have sinned, I have done wrong, I have spoken unkindly. Those I all started to call the little bird. I don't know where that came from. It was just the only words that came to me as I contemplated what the nudge might be. And then I will always remember the day standing next to my kitchen sink on the phone with Jay when I dared to tell him about a little bird that was nudging me. And he said, yes, and Quakers call that God. If that is God, then my relationship to that nudge should be taken a lot more seriously. How many times I have failed to listen, and how many times I have walked that path and found that joy and known that there were others with me and that we were creating the kingdom of God together. There was one time I was settling into my morning worship, my morning prayer devotional time, and I told God a joke. For the very first time I joked with her. I said, God, you must be a terrible communicator because your nudges are just so subtle. If you want me to do what you want, I would be happy to. Please just make it a little bit clearer. And you know what? In that moment, this beautiful bubble of clarity welled up in me. And she said that the subtlety reveals the very nature of God. I have grown up in a culture where God is a domineering man sitting on a cloud shouting. And to think of some new adjectives that are needing to be used here. Gentle, bedrock, underlying, faithfully accompanying, never letting go of me. That hymn we sang last night, "Great is thy faithfulness to me," speaks my experience without deserving it. She comes back to me again and again and offers me the invitation to walk toward the kingdom of God. And I am utterly grateful. In fear and in trembling, be bold in God's service. The funny thing about being bold there is I don't believe it's about an outward boldness. It's not about the level of risk we're willing to take. It's about the boldness of taking that little nudge seriously. The boldness with every doubt still intact of taking it seriously enough to turn our lives over to it. That we may together submit ourselves to that guidance and end up where we belong.
A member of our junior high yearly meeting offered us this ministry this morning. The community flourishes in transition, in the not quite being spaces. As we bring our time here together to a close, I want to invite us to be in the not quite being space. We will leave this time of gathering, but not this time of worship, and adjourn to anchor groups, or if you aren't in an anchor group, to the next piece that's right for you. A note from our anchor group conveners is that if you aren't in an anchor group and feel that there's a hole in your yearly meeting experience that could be filled by being part of it, it's not too late. There are still opportunities to join anchor groups. And if you want to do so, or you didn't find your anchor group yesterday, please see Jay O'Hara at the back of this hall as we leave. We've been asked to consider our friends with mobility needs and to let them rise and make their way out first. And so those friends who need a little more time getting where they're going, if you want to get up and start to make your way, please do. And those folks who are convening anchor groups, if you want to get up and go to the back so that those in your anchor groups can find you, please do. And friends who are part of anchor groups can get up and find your leaders. And those of us who aren't in an anchor group can hold this whole transition, this in-between space in our prayers. Thank you, friends.